The Eyes of the Killer Robot by John Bellairs, Chapter 9. On the following evening, Fergie, Johnny, and the Professor were up in the mountains. It was dark again, and it was pouring rain, and the three of them were standing around and staring at the maroon Pontiac, which was pulled off onto a muddy patch of ground near the road. The car had a flat tire that sagged like a collapsed pudding. With a jack handle clenched in his fist, the Professor stood, staring down at the tire in disbelief. He was wearing an old rubber rain poncho, and he was almost speechless with rage. "I hate cars," he snarled through clenched teeth. "If the people who run this country had any imagination, we'd be able to take buses anywhere at any time, so we could avoid ridiculous messes like this one." He heaved a deep sigh and wiped rain off his face with his sleeve. "Oh, well," he said wearily, "I guess I'd better stop crabbing and start jacking this miserable crate up." "Do you know how to work a jack, Professor?" asked Johnny timidly. The Professor turned and glared at him. "I most certainly do," he said indignantly. "I changed the tire of an army truck while we were being shelled during the Battle of the Argonne Forest. Now stand back, please, and give me some room." With a lot of grumbling and cursing, the Professor got busy. He had to work in the dark because he had forgotten to bring a flashlight. Carefully, he edged the jack under the car. Then he stuck the handle into the socket and started pumping. Slowly, the car rose, and then something bad happened. With a lurch, the car rolled forward, and the jack fell over. The Professor had forgotten to put the car in gear. Swearing violently, the old man hurled the jack handle out into the middle of the road. Then he stomped out to get it. But as he was walking back, he stopped and stared at something. Holding his hand up to shield his glasses from the rain, the Professor peered for a long time. "John!" he called. "John! Byron, do my eyes deceive me, or is there a light down the road there?" Johnny and Fergie walked out to where the Professor was. Sure enough, far down the road, a blob of yellow light could be seen. "How about that?" said the Professor, as he took off his glasses and dried them with his handkerchief. "I thought this road was deserted, so I never even bothered to, but see here, we're wasting time. Let's hike on down there and see if we can get some help. I'd love to have a hot cup of coffee and a chance to dry out, and I imagine you two feel the same way. Come on." The Professor put his glasses back on, and the three of them tramped down the road through the falling rain. As they got closer, they began to make out the shadowy outline of a building. Fergie had the best eye of the three, and he said that it looked like a gas station. "Great," said the Professor, and he began to walk faster. "Wonderful. Maybe I'll be able to get some cigarettes and to throw away my Balkan-so brains because they got all soggy." At last they arrived, and it did turn out to be a gas station after all. There were 2 Esso pumps in a little one-story building with a slate roof. On the front of the building was an oblong window with a pink neon gas sign in it. And nailed up next to the door was a blue X-Lax thermometer. Kicking spurs of water into the air, the Professor ran forward and jerked open the screen door. He pushed at the inside door and a little bell tinkled. The boys crowded in behind the Professor, and now all 3 of them were standing in the little store. There was a small glass-topped display case that held cigars and pipe tobacco, and next to it, in a corner, was a scarred wooden chair with a cat curled up on its seat. Behind the counter were shelves full of canned food and a door that probably led to the back room. But the door stayed closed. Nobody came to answer the bell. "Humph," said the Professor, as he glanced discontentedly around. Isn't that just the limit? The attendant leaves the light on and the door open and just goes away. It's not the kind of evening for a long stroll in the woods, is it? Oh, well. He may have been called away by some emergency. Let's see if he turns up." They waited. A small metal clock on the shelf ticked noisily, and rain rattled on the roof. The cat slept peacefully. Finally, just as the Professor was getting ready to go outside and stretch, the door behind the counter opened. Out stepped a tall, gaunt old man who wore grease-stained overalls and a blue work shirt. He had a big mop of white hair, and there was a wart the size of a pea near the end of his nose. The skin of the old man's face was saggy, and his eyes were red-rimmed. He looked as if he had been sick for a long time, and he moved slowly. Oddly enough, his hands were long, pale, delicate, and soft-skinned. They didn't look like the hands of a man who spent his time fixing cars and pumping gas. "I'm sorry to have kept you folks waiting," said the man as he pulled the door shut behind him. "I must have dozed off, so I didn't hear the bell. Is there anything I can help you with?" Johnny's eyebrows rose. He had expected the man to use bad grammar the way his grandpa did, but this man spoke clearly and precisely with a faint trace of an English accent. It was strange. The professor had also noticed the man's peculiar way of speaking, but his mind was on other things. He wanted to get his flat tire fixed so they could be on their way. Harumphing and coughing, he put on his best businesslike manner and told the old man what their problem was. The man stood dead still while the professor talked, but he didn't seem to be paying much attention to what he was saying. He said at last. "You say you have a flat tire. Unfortunately, I can't do any heavy work. I hurt my back some time ago, but I have a young man who helps me sometimes. Let me see if I can locate him." As the professor stood, drumming his fingers impatiently on the counter, the old man pulled a telephone out of a cubbyhole in the wall and gave the operator a number. He muttered into the phone for a bit and then hung up. "He'll be coming very soon," the man announced. Then he smiled strangely and added, "He doesn't have very far to go to get here. I'm lucky I found him in. Would you all like some coffee while you're waiting?" The three travelers nodded eagerly, and the old man disappeared into the back room again. Humming tunelessly, the professor went to the window and watched the rain fall. Fergie took his jackknife out of his pocket, opened the small blade, and began cleaning his fingernails. Johnny started acting fidgety. He was getting more and more nervous by the minute, and he began to get the creepy idea that someone was staring at him. He could feel the stare. It was like heat coming from a radiator, and the stare seemed to be coming from the row of shelves behind the counter. But when Johnny looked, he saw nothing but cans and boxes. He told himself that he was having his emergency jitters. Every time something went wrong, he started imagining all sorts of wild things, so he paced and tried to ignore his feelings. After about a quarter of an hour had passed, the old man came back with a tray and 3 china mugs full of hot coffee. Sighing wearily, he began handing the mugs around, one for the professor, one for Fergie, and one for Johnny. The coffee tasted delicious. As they sipped, the old man went to the door and peered out into the rainy darkness. "Here he comes," he said suddenly. "Oh, good. He'll be able to help you. He'll have that flat tire fixed for you in no time." The professor peered out the door and saw a shadowy figure standing just outside the light. He wondered why he hadn't heard a car motor, but then it occurred to him that there were houses in the hills around this place. The young man had probably come down from some mountain path on foot. Oh well, he was here. That was the important thing. Quickly, the professor took another sip of coffee, but when he turned to Johnny, he stopped short. Johnny's face was deathly pale. I feel sick," he moaned. "I feel like I'm coming down with something. I'm sorry, I really am." The professor sighed and patted Johnny on the shoulder. John, he said, "you do not need to apologize for being ill. If you're sick, you're sick, as my dear mother used to say. Why don't you stay here and keep dry while we follow the mechanic back to the car? There's no reason for you to get soaked and catch pneumonia." "The prof's right, John, baby," Fergie added. "You stay here and we'll be back in a jiffy, okay?" Johnny nodded. He was really miserable. He felt feverish and drowsy, and all the strength seemed to be draining out of his body. All right," he murmured, rubbing his hand over his face. "I'll see you guys later." Fergie and the professor went out, and the screen door slammed behind them. Johnny heard their footsteps as they splashed across the wet pavement. He couldn't understand why, but he felt vaguely frightened. He did not want to be left alone with the old man. "I'm just imagining things," Johnny told himself. "You get weird ideas when you have a fever." He turned and looked for some place where he could sit down, but the cat was still sleeping in the chair, and the old man had not offered to find Johnny another seat. The clock ticked, and the rain pattered on. As Johnny watched blearily, the old man shuffled around the counter and started fussing with some cans that were on a shelf. With his back to Johnny, the man started to talk. "Isn't it odd how you sometimes think someone is looking at you when you're alone in a room?" he said suddenly. Johnny's vision was blurring, and he was getting sleepier by the minute. But the words that the old man spoke struck terror into his heart. In a flash, he was wide awake as he watched in horror the man step to one side, and Johnny saw something on the shelf that he hadn't seen before. It was a yellowish human skull with 2 glass eyes in the hollow sockets. The old man grinned wickedly, and the skull stared, and the room whirled around Johnny. Then everything went black, and he fell unconscious to the floor. And that's the end of chapter 9.